And the other thing we can do is even more as historians is confront a word that's often used, which is unprecedented. The talk since 2015 was often of an unprecedented refugee crisis. Those are the three words that tripped off everyone's tongue. And I have to say, there are precedents. It's not unprecedented. So it becomes, incumbent on us to think what is precedented and what is unprecedented. And if you say, well, the numbers are unprecedented, I can say, no, they're not. As a historian, if you say the challenge of addressing the refugee crisis is unprecedented, I can say, no, it's not. Because you've only got to go back to the 1940s, for example, to see what was happening then.
You are listening to Seeking Refuge, a podcast sharing the human stories of refugees. Welcome back to part 2 of our 2-part dive into the history of modern refugees. The person you just heard is our guest, Professor Peter Gatrell of the University of Manchester, and I'm your host, Aidan Thomason. Today you're going to hear the second half of my conversation with Peter, which will cover the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees and the creation of the UNHCR, and then we'll follow that line up to the present. If you haven't heard last week's episode, I recommend you pause this and go listen to the first half of our conversation. But here's a quick recap of what Peter and I covered in that episode. As borders began to develop and crystallize in the 19th century, the world began to see groups of displaced people, refugees, who are fleeing across borders to escape violence. The creation of new nation-states after World War I led to groups fleeing and new countries deciding who they wanted to allow in and who they didn't. The rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s created even more refugees. And then, after the end of World War II and its immediate aftermath, the world had millions upon millions of people displaced by war. By the time the 1950s arrived, the world had an estimated 165 million refugees, out of a total global population of about 2.5 billion people. There were 60 million people displaced in Europe due to the war, 15 million in South Asia, largely due to the Partition of India, 1 million Palestinians displaced following the creation of the State of Israel, and 90 million displaced in the Far East due to the Japanese occupation of China and the 1949 revolution that led to the creation of the People's Republic of China. All of this means that, roughly speaking, over 6.5% of all people on Earth were refugees. There became a pressing need to have some international mechanism to deal with the refugees who were moving all over the world. A response came in 1950 in the creation of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, aka UNHCR, and in 1951 in the form of the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees.
We've looked at the kind of explosion, as it were, of people on the move in the late 1940s. And there are two organizations that were set up to address the issue of refugees. One was called the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and that got going in 1943-44, so before the end of the war. And basically, as far as refugees were concerned, it saw its role as trying to support these displaced people to return to their homes. And it was followed in 46-47 by an international refugee organization, which was basically doing similar sorts of things, but increasingly turning its mind to the question of those refugees who did not want to return to their homes. So it was beginning to encourage programs of what was called resettlement. So not repatriation, but resettlement. And so using voluntary organizations to help people to resettle in Latin America, for example, South America, Australia, other parts of the world. But there was also a realization that it hadn't completely addressed that, and that there were large numbers of refugees still in need of protection of one kind or another. And there were several months and months of discussion leading to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which was eventually adopted by a relatively small number, a dozen or so states, not the United States, which we could say something about, but Britain, France, Belgium, and so on, Western European countries primarily, not exclusively. And they decided on a convention that would focus upon assisting or protecting refugees, and they came up with a definition of who is a refugee. And a refugee, according to the convention, was an individual who had a well-founded claim of persecution on certain sorts of grounds, race, religion, and so forth, membership of a social group.
The actual text of the 1951 convention defines a refugee as a person who, quote, as a result of events occurring before the 1st of January 1951, and owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling, to avail himself to the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, as a result of such events, is unable, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. Fun fact about this convention, the United States has actually never signed on to it, although it has signed on to the 1967 protocol, which we'll get to later. Here's why the convention matters.
And that was very important because it made it incumbent. It required the individual to demonstrate that he or she had a well-founded claim. Your claim could be turned down, in other words. If your claim was accepted, the important right you had as a refugee, as a recognized refugee, was that you couldn't be returned to your country of origin against your will. And that's fundamental. Then as now, if you have recognition under the convention, you cannot be forcibly returned to the country of origin unless you agree. And that right was enshrined in the convention, and more states eventually signed, adhere to that rule. But there are other things that are important about the convention, Aidan. One is that it provided that a refugee was someone who had been persecuted as a result of events in Europe prior to 1951. Well, you could, if you signed up, sort of finesse that a bit, but basically it's saying Europe prior to 1951, persecution. So you can begin to see this is a convention that's as it were, designed to say to the Soviet Union, you're the enemy here, because you're persecuting people and they don't want to return because they fear the threat of persecution as members of the wrong social class or members of the wrong religion, and so on and so forth. It becomes complicated because eventually the convention, these restrictions are relaxed in 1969, 67, I beg your pardon. It means that it's looking back as much as it's looking forward if you sign the convention. And one of the things that's always intrigued me is that you've got the convention and you've got something else that survives after 1951, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. The two are kind of closely connected. They're both still in existence. But the UNHCR's job is to kind of operate under the convention. Well, you could then say, wait a minute, UNHCR is actively supporting Hungarian refugees in 1956. How can it do that? This is not 1951 or pre-1951. This is 1956. How are they part of the convention? How are they part of the UNHCR's regime? And the answer is that the lawyers in Geneva, which is where UNHCR is based, said, yes, why are they refugees? Because they're protesting communist rule. When was communist rule set up? Before 1951. So it's happening in 1956, this revolt against communism in Hungary, but it's happening because communism was already in place before 1951, so they're eligible. And this has always fascinated me, because it suggests that you've got an institution, UNHCR, and you've got a convention, which is very, very important, but there's a degree of wiggle room, there's a degree of flexibility. You're not, as it were, totally in a kind of bed that you can't escape from. And that's, and of course, UNHCR eventually spreads its remit and so begins to get involved in Algeria in the late 1950s, when there's a revolt against the French rule, and later on in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But it never gets involved in India until 1971, when there's a war between the two halves of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, which leads to the formation of the state of Bangladesh in 1971. And then UNHCR is involved. But it doesn't get involved in partition. And it doesn't get involved in lots of other episodes as well, because it's not welcome. Remember, states can always say, we don't want you on our territory. This is our sovereign state. We're not going to be dictated to by you. So it always has to tread carefully and sort of ask permission to come and get involved.
I then circled back to the Partition of India, which Peter had mentioned several times, and the fact that UNHCR hadn't gotten involved in it. For those who don't know, the Partition of India was when the former British colony of India was divided into the countries India and Pakistan, with the idea being to create one Hindu and one Muslim majority state. It was the last major formally forced migration caused by a border redrawing, and the current animosity between India and Pakistan can be traced back to this moment. If you've never learned about it, like I hadn't until last year, I'd recommend looking into it more after this episode.
It's really worth reading about. There are a lot of Indian historians who are doing great work on the Partition of India, have been for 20 or 30 years, young scholars doing fantastic work. And one of the things that's coming out of their work is partly that it's not a momentary thing. I mean, of course, there's a rupture in 1947 and lots of people flee across the borders. But one scholar talks of the long partition. So this is a protracted episode, particularly in the eastern part of India, Bengal. But also it's important work, because going back to what we were talking about at the beginning about refugees as actors, of course the state says, this is what we're going to do for you, belatedly. This is how we're going to rehabilitate you. That was a favourite word of the 40s and 50s. We're going to rehabilitate you. The refugees said, we don't want to be pushed around. So you've got refugees who are kind of asserting themselves and saying, we want rights. We don't want charity. We want rights. And we want the right to determine how we live, where we live. Don't push us around. So, if you do more reading on partition, I hope you'll begin to read more about the way in which refugees are not, as it were, inanimate. They're not just plastic, objects of government intervention. Governments always want to push people around, but people fight or resist being pushed around, and I always find that rather encouraging.
So, asking about the UNHCR's evolution, because obviously at this point in the present, it's basically the final authority on refugees around the world. So, how did that evolve? When did other states like the U.S. start getting involved, and when did its reach expand?
And the UNHCR has thousands and thousands of staff now, all around the world, and a budget. I can't remember the precise figure, but it's grown in ways that were never anticipated at the time. When it was set up in 51, it was given a kind of 3-year lifespan. That's also interesting to think that people thought, we'll wrap all this up in 3 years. So by 54, 55, everything will be done and dusted. I think what happened then was that UNHCR made itself useful to states. It could give them a kind of credibility by saying we're part of the international community, and we've demonstrated that because we've signed the convention, and where we cooperate with UNHCR. And once you get to the case we just discussed of Bangladesh, UNHCR acts as a kind of instrument or kind of clearinghouse, helping to manage huge amounts of money that are being organized, collected through the United Nations member states, and helping to mobilize hundreds of non-governmental organizations, what are called at the time voluntary agencies, what we now call NGOs or non-governmental organizations. So it becomes a kind of useful element in international politics, and the kind of cornerstone of what's now called the international refugee regime. Nevertheless, it remains kind of bound or constrained partly by the fact that it relies upon contributions from member states. Now, I'm not sure, I can't remember reading whether the Trump administration was cutting its contribution to UNHCR, probably was, but it was an indication that an organization like UNHCR relies upon contributions that otherwise it can't function. So it's always got to bear in mind that someone else is paying us, and that's member states. And the other thing, as I said a moment ago, is that the significance of state sovereignty means that states are at liberty to say, we'll take care of this, thank you very much. Please stay out of our territory. But, there are some situations, I think of Cambodian refugees in the 1970s. So these are, not unlike the Armenian refugees and the Jewish refugees we spoke about earlier. They are the survivors of genocide who have moved into Thailand to escape the Khmer Rouge. And they're living in refugee camps in large numbers along the Thai-Cambodian border. Well, the Thai government, it hasn't got the capacity to support large numbers of Cambodian refugees. So here you have an example where a state is happy to enlist the support of UNHCR because it knows that UNHCR can tap sources of funding and get NGOs involved, and that's important. But then there are also debates within UNHCR about what should we be doing. What is it that we should be? What's our rationale? What's our purpose? And so I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but I think there are two things that are important in the evolution of UNHCR. One is that it increasingly gets interested in ideas of development. And what that means is that if you're looking at low-income countries, where a lot of the world's refugees tend to be, you have situations where refugees have presented themselves in large numbers, and this creates enormous strain on resources locally and pressure points, because local communities say, we can't support refugees. How can we do this? So UNHCR comes on the scene in the 60s, 70s and says, well, here we've got projects, we can put refugees into camps, or we can help through tapping development funds, which means that everybody benefits. Refugees are looked after, and here there's some employment opportunities for you or aid. So UNHCR develops its own kind of development agenda certainly by the 1970s. That's one thing. The other thing about the evolution of UNHCR is that it increasingly says we should be interested in repatriation. And you have UNHCR involved, along with other organizations, repatriation in the Horn of Africa, repatriation of Vietnamese, for example, in the 1980s to Vietnam, on the grounds that it's what they call a durable solution. Refugees have been displaced. How do we solve the problem? We encourage repatriation. And you think, great, repatriation, it's a nice sounding word. Patria, repatriate. Until you realize that it's often taking place without refugees' agreement or without their participation. So UNHCR agrees with the two countries involved where refugees are, where they should be repatriated to engineer repatriation. And this is sometimes a very painful process. So, you can say UNHCR is a good institution, force for good, better that it exists than it does not exist. I firmly believe that. But it doesn't mean that everything it does with kind of squeaky clean hands.
Yeah, I do also believe that about the UNHCR, but I think the more I learn about it, the more I am coming up with discovering those moments where they do things without refugees' permission or do things that don't seem quite squeaky clean, like you said. So I think that it is an interesting conversation to have.
Well, it's happening within UNHCR. UNHCR is when it began, so we're talking sort of 70 odd years ago, it was basically a small club of white men. Not entirely, but very largely. It's now much more multinational. It's much more diverse, but it still cannot altogether escape the idea that although it speaks the cozy language of repatriation or participation or resilience, there are lots of kind of buzzwords around UNHCR, that it struggles with the idea of a genuine partnership, because it's much easier to say refugees, special kind of humanity, victims, degraded, not quite human. So therefore we need to be assisting them in a kind of patronizing way. And I've always struggled against that idea that we bracket off refugees as a kind of distinct form of humankind. That they're not. And why is it that they're treated as people who have to have things done to them rather than as people who can be actively involved and consulted in their own future?
Yeah, that's a question that we've had come up a lot on our show. I think especially in the U.S. context, at least during the last several years, the two narratives have been either refugees as invaders or refugees as people without agency that need to be helped. And both of those narratives are dehumanizing. So that's also a really important conversation to be had.
And also, Aidan, it takes us back to where we began in Russia in 1915, because I can find you plenty of examples where there's this mobilization of charity and self-mobilization, refugees helping themselves, and they're depicted or represented as victims, suffering victims. Well, suffering victims, what can you do except reach out a hand of friendship and support? But you also get this parallel narrative of refugees as, what on earth are they doing? My life was all right until all of a sudden I've got thousands of refugees banging on the door. And so it's never, it seems to me as a historian, never possible to say there's a pure narrative of victimhood going on here, or a pure narrative of the invader. they often go, closely hand in hand.
Next, I wanted to walk forward a bit in time. Since the UNHCR originally was meant to help World War II refugees, and now it has no geographic or time restrictions due to a later convention called the 1967 Protocol, I asked Peter what trends were seen in the rise of new refugee conflicts after the late 1940s and early 50s. Immediately, things like decolonization, ethnic conflicts, and state collapse came to my mind, but I wanted to hear what he sees as a historian.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about ethnic cleansing or confrontation, and find plenty of examples of it. The classic examples that come to mind in the late 20th century would be Yugoslavia, the wars of former Yugoslavia, and in the early to mid 1990s, events in Rwanda. Both raising questions about ethnic cleansing and genocide, both creating the same sorts of issues of survivors who are displaced, and both of them involving UNHCR and voluntary organizations, and both of them failures of international, on an international scale, leaving millions in their wake. But I think we can, if we're talking about ethnic conflict and civil war, in our discussion, we've already seen that these are not new phenomena. So I think what's distinctive, perhaps, is that in the case of Rwanda, there are feelings that people were left abandoned. The international community might have done more, but failed to do so. It was left really picking up the pieces. In the case of Yugoslavia, I mean, what's always struck me is that this was a stable state until the 1990s. Communism held it together. You could argue that communism held the Soviet Union together. But although there have been instances of conflict in the former Soviet Union, so Georgia, the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, conflict in Ukraine, it hasn't produced the same level of catastrophic bloodletting that you have in the former Yugoslavia. And that's something I still struggle to comprehend. But I'm mindful of the fact that in the case of former Yugoslavia, one of the key actors was the Serbian state. And as it got embroiled in a conflict sometimes of its own making, it capitalized on images of the Serbian nation as a persecuted nation. And one of the things that always interested me as a historian was that as Serbia promoted itself as the victim in this conflict rather than the perpetrator, it said, yes, we have to remember what happened in 1916. Serbia, 15 and 16, Serbia was invaded by the Habsburg, by the Austrian armies, and a third of the Serbian nation had to flee. So don't tell us that we're the perpetrator. We're the victims, as we were in the First World War. Not sure how far I've gone in answering your question, but I mean, I think there are issues around state collapse in both cases that suggest that historical perspective can help here. Why is there so much alarm on the part of a Serbian population? It's the kind of intensification of ideas of suffering that have a long genealogy. In the case of Rwanda, one of the things that's striking there is that Rwanda, 30 years before the genocide, had been a colony of Belgium, and the collapse of the Belgian colonial rule had created a refugee crisis in 1959 through to 1962. So in each case we can see kind of antecedents of conflict, and it becomes easy for one side to point to persecution or victimization in previous times and say, well, we're not the perpetrator, we're the victim here.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I just have two more questions. But I think going off of this answer that you just gave, as a historian and looking at the refugee crisis through a historical lens, what do you make of the current state of the world today, the migration situation right now?
I think if we look at it from a purely European or even a British perspective, you get a very partial, parochial view of what's going on. I can't speak for the United States, although obviously I'm aware of debates and practices over the last few years in relation to the southern part of the south of the United States, or its southern border. In the UK, there's a lot of political talk and sometimes anxiety about refugees who come knocking on the door. But what is usually overlooked is that the numbers are tiny in proportion to the world's refugee population. So most of the world's refugees, if we think about it today, are in Syria or in adjacent states, or in Afghanistan or in adjacent states, or in Sudan, South Sudan, in adjacent states. This is, and we now think of Bangladesh as hosting Rohingya Muslims persecuted by the state of Myanmar. So from time to time, these catastrophes register on the radar of British politics, as I'm sure they do in US politics. But it can often be a very inward-looking conversation that really thinks of the United States as a particular in a particular situation of threat, or you mentioned the word invasion, and the idea of a flood or invasion circulates from time to time in Britain. So I think one of the things that we can do as historians is to unsettle, if I can use the title of my book again, to unsettle the idea that it's all happening in one part of the world, in the privileged West. And the other thing we can do is even more as historians is confront a word that's often used, which is unprecedented. So, the talk since 2015 was often of an unprecedented refugee crisis. Those are the three words that tripped off everyone's tongue. And I have to say, there are precedents. It's not unprecedented. So it becomes, incumbent on us to think what is precedented and what is unprecedented. And if you say, well, the numbers are unprecedented, I can say, no, they're not. As a historian, if you say the challenge of addressing the refugee crisis is unprecedented, I can say, no, it's not. Because you've only got to go back to the 1940s, for example, to see what was happening then. So I think this is really important. And the other thing I would say about today, and it goes back to right to the beginning of our conversation, Aidan, is can we begin to think even now in 2021 about what a history of refugees will look like in 20 years' time, 50 years' time? And, will we be able to look back on 2015 to 2021 and begin to understand refugees as flesh and blood people, or as groups of people who deserve to be taken seriously, to engage with, but to engage with wherever possible on terms of equality, rather than I have the power and you don't. So I always think it's, we're in the here and now where there's an emergency. Yes, but there have been emergencies in the past. And sometimes these emergencies have been resolved satisfactorily. But in doing that, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that refugees are not they might be categorized as a distinct part of humanity. You are a refugee. It doesn't mean that we have to follow that the whole way through and think of them as a separate kind of person.
Before I let Peter go, I wanted to give him a chance to talk about his book, which he mentioned during our conversation several times. And I also wanted to see what he's currently working on.
Okay. Well, I started work on a book at the invitation of a publisher, which was going to be a history of immigration to Europe. And you could see why a publisher was interested in this. There'd been a vote to leave the European Union. A lot of that was a debate couched in terms of immigration. And so they wanted me to write about this. I said, yeah, I'll write a book about this. But actually what I want to write a book about is the history of Europe, and a history of Europe on the move. By which I meant that it's not just about immigration. The history of Europe since 1945 is a history of migration, of people coming and going. And to think of it as migration means that we can talk about internal migration. So you could say all sorts of significant things about internal migration in Italy, for example, or Spain, or the Soviet Union. People think about the Soviet Union. What is it about immigration in the Soviet Union? People couldn't come, they couldn't go. Wait a minute. There's a massive movement of people within the frontiers of the Soviet Union. So let's write about that as well. Then I wanted to talk about refugees, but to talk about this in ways that talk not just about policy and not just about the catastrophes that we've talked about, the wars and the civil wars, but also to think about how refugees acted themselves and how they helped one another, and the same with migrant workers. So it was partly about what I call the violent peacetime after the Second World War, when things were far from straightforwardly peaceful. So it's about this violence, but it was also about rebuilding, and then it was about the consequences of decolonization. Italy, the Netherlands, Britain, France, Portugal later on. All of this decolonization, came home, so to speak, in the shape of people. Most dramatically in the case of France, really, really great, often very poignant, but great to write about the consequences of the French decolonization in the late 50s through to the 1970s. So it covers an awful lot of ground, and there's lots more to say, and I've got more notes if I was doing the book again or a new edition. But right now I'm doing something much more specific, and that is looking at UNHCR and refugees in the 50s and 60s, because I've come across all sorts of material in which refugees are writing to UNHCR in the 50s and 60s from different parts of the world and saying, hear my case. And this is unique material because we can't interview people in the 50s, 60s, or very unlikely to be able to interview people who were refugees so long ago, but we've got their voices. So how did they express themselves? In what kind of terms? What did they want? And how were they received? So it's a kind of attempt to write a refugee history with refugees to the foreground rather than in the background.
That was our guest, Professor Peter Gatrell, talking with us again about the history of modern refugees and his new book, The Unsettling of Europe. There's a link to buy the book in our show notes if you want to check it out. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review us in the comments below. If you'd like to get in touch with us, email us at seekingrefugepodcast@gmail.com. Follow us at Refuge Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for all the updates on our show. We'd love to do more historical episodes in the future, so let us know what time periods, locations, and stories you'd like to learn more about by contacting us via email, on social media, or in the comments wherever you get your podcasts. As always, a huge thank you to Maxi International House for making our show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.